You're tuning in to the O&P Check-in, an SPS podcast. I'm Brendan Erickson, a regional sales manager at SPS. This show brings you the latest happenings in the O&P industry. We're unpacking trends and news from this tight-knit orthotics and prosthetics community. Co-hosting with me today is SPS Sales Account Manager and Team USA para-athlete, Travis Ricks. Welcome, Travis.
Thanks, Brendan. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Let's get started.
Introducing the new CPO Ceiling 3D Liner from Ottobock. Designed for conical residual limbs, this ceiling liner delivers a proper fit and a secure hold for transfemoral amputees. Revolutionize your patient's prosthetic experience with the Ottobock 6Y111 CPO Ceiling 3D Liner. Visit spsco.com today to learn more.
Hi, everybody. Today we have some little bit bittersweet news that we need to tell you about. Unfortunately and fortunately for Jackie, she has taken a great new position and she's no longer going to be a co-host on our show. So we are very sad to hear that, but also very excited for her and her own personal growth and development. Jackie, how do you feel?
I'm trying to not cry, as Brendan and Ellen both know.
Yep.
I've really loved doing this podcast, being part of this team. I think it's been so cool and such a great way to learn more about the O&P industry. I know I'm still a rookie and have so much more growing to do. So it's just been amazing. I want to thank all of our listeners for letting me be a part of amplifying voices in the industry and being a part of this show. And Brendan, thank you for being such a great co-host. I'm really going to miss doing this.
Well, yeah. I know it's like we've grown up together. Neither of us had any podcasting experience, and we've had a ton of fun. We've made a lot of mistakes. The outtake floor is full, but it truly has been such a great experience, I think, for both of us personally, not only just meeting all the awesome guests we've had on the show, but learning a ton of stuff as well. But we sure are sad to see you go, and we're so happy for the time we had with you. And how much you helped grow this podcast. So take that with you and know that you left a mark and that you have very big shoes to fill for whomever follows in your footsteps.
Well, don't scare anyone away, Brendan. So again, thank you, everyone.
Well, they got to deal with me.
You're the easy part. But seriously, thank you again, everyone, for just letting me have a voice and be a part of kind of what we're doing here on the O&P Check-in. And we may convince some other folks over the next so many episodes to give co-hosting a try before we settle on my full-time replacement. So just be merciful as everyone dabbles in podcast hosting. As Brendan said, we've kind of grown a lot together and have tackled this together. So for sure, whoever comes on next, just give them a shot and give us your feedback too, because maybe you might be able to sway who stays on long term. So without further ado.
That's right. And if you guys see Jackie out in the field after this, definitely let her know how much you liked her beautiful voice and her commentary and jokes and great insight. So again, thank you, Jackie. And without further ado, let's get to this new episode. Hello, listeners. I'm excited to welcome today's guest. You may remember him from the Oasis 2 episode, and we're very happy to have him back. Phil Stevens is here. Phil is the Vice President of Clinical Affairs at the Hanger Institute, where he develops evidence-based clinical programs designed to help patients improve their orthotic and prosthetic outcomes. Welcome, Phil. Glad to have you back.
Thank you, Brendan. Good to be with you today.
We're really glad you could join us to share the insights from the newly released Hanger Institute annual report. Could you just kick us off by sharing a little about how you yourself got your start in O&P?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting story. I have an uncle that lost his hand in a hang gliding accident. And so I remember I have memories from a very young age when I was over playing with my cousin and watching that uncle. I still have vivid memories of him eating his cornflakes with his prosthesis and buttoning a button-down shirt with his prosthesis. And so I think I was pretty enamored with prosthetics from a very early age, just from watching how my uncle got the basic tasks done that needed to be done every day.
Thank you for sharing, Phil. That's a great connection to the community we serve. Now, let's dive into today's topic, the Hanger Institute Annual Report. Phil, what is this report for listeners who may be unfamiliar?
Sure. So I think the first part of that question is maybe what is the Institute? What is the Hanger Institute? We recognized a few years ago that we were uniquely positioned to be involved in the research community, right? We see a lot of patients, we collect a lot of outcomes. And so we have a bit of a stewardship, if you will, to understand those patient populations better, to aggregate those outcomes, to aggregate those observations, and to generate research findings that advance the field, that protect access for patients across the field, or maybe create access for patients across the field, to really understand what technologies provide which benefits to given populations, and really understand the value proposition associated with so much of what we do. So that's what the Institute is all about. The Institute is leveraging our breadth to really engage in the research side of the field and do so in a very clinically focused way. We're very active in that space. We publish a lot of manuscripts. We present a lot of podium presentations, again, trying to advocate for patients and for the field. But we recognize that while that stuff is going on in academic journals and in professional conferences around the country, not everyone is in attendance in those events. Not everyone has access to those journals. And so the rationale behind the annual report was we wanted to do an annual summary of that research activity and put it in a mechanism that the field can access and understand fairly quickly and fairly conveniently. So we did our first annual report that kind of summarized all of our activity from the inception of the Institute to today, really summarizing a lot of the publication activity, a lot of the presentation activity. And then the topic of conversation today is our second annual report, which was just released earlier this month. Similar document in that it really just aggregates the research activity from the past 12 months. With the intent of putting some quick summaries together in a way that anyone in the field can kind of flip through the document and understand the progress that we've tried to make in any given area.
It's pretty awesome, and it's such a great job by you guys, and it's a great macro explanation of it, but let's dive into the micro and kind of highlight some of the things that you guys are sharing with the industry. The first chapter shares interesting findings from the recent Castle 1 study. For those that may not be aware of that, can you first walk us through what it is and what this study is trying to summarize and the insights you gained from it?
Yeah, the Castle manuscript is a really exciting one. It was published last year. Hanger has a standard outcomes collection protocol that we follow in all of our clinics across the country. And for our individuals with lower limb amputation, we collect outcomes data relative to mobility. Now we collect other things relative to things like satisfaction and quality of life, but we collect these mobility values on all of our patients as they come in. We collect at baseline, we collect at follow-up. We've collected enough of these that we can talk about data points in the tens of thousands and even the hundreds of thousands of data points. When you have that much data, you can start to do some really cool things. The data that we have in Castle gives us a mobility curve, if you will. I think people that listening to the podcast probably know about the growth curves that a pediatrician might have, right? They have one for head circumference. They have one for your child's weight. At this age, this is the average weight, and this is the standard deviation on either side. And so we kind of know where your child should be if they're in the 90th percentile or the 5th percentile, just to give you some idea of where your child sits relative to their peers. Where Castle allows us to do the same thing within the prosthetic community with respect to their mobility. So with our Castle data, with the tables that are available in that manuscript, and I should stop here and share that anyone who wants to can access the annual report. Anyone who wants to can access summaries of the Castle manuscript. And the tables in those resources are a lot like the growth curves that you would see at a pediatrician's office. So if I know a given patient's amputation level, their amputation etiology, and their age, I have a pretty good idea of where their prosthetic mobility should be. That's valuable because that allows me to sit down with that patient. There's a couple scenarios that we could easily paint out here. I could have a patient who's doing everything right, but they're very frustrated because they don't know what they're comparing themselves against. So, maybe they were running marathons prior to their amputation and they're not running marathons anymore. So they're a little discouraged with where they're at in their rehabilitation. But I can go to that Castle manuscript and help them see that they're actually functioning above average and they need to give themselves a little bit of grace. By contrast, I may have the opposite scenario. I may have a patient who's gotten real comfortable on the couch, and I can take a look at their mobility and plot their mobility against that of their peers and let them know that that there's opportunity there. There's room for growth. There's room for improvement. So, what Castle does is so many of our lower limb amputees may not have an immediate peer community that gives them some sense of where they fit in. The Castle manuscript allows us to put their prosthetic mobility in a meaningful context so that they know how they're doing relative to their peers.
Well, so that's awesome that you can set a baseline, and I'm sure that baselines, vary from patient to patient. Does it take into account varying things like componentry or anything else?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it does. Let me back up. There's one observation I didn't make that I should have made. I think one of the things that the graphs really give us is just how stable prosthetic mobility is. I think there's this general assumption that amputees sort of digress in their mobility or decline in their mobility over time, and we do see that, but we really don't see that until your early 70s to mid 70s. So people talk about how 60 is the new 40 and 65 is the new 45. That really does seem to hold true from the standpoint of prosthetic mobility. We see that mobility levels are fairly stable until very late in life. You asked the question about componentry. And we have seen some really interesting things relative to componentry. Not surprisingly, the component where we see the biggest impact is microprocessor knees. And so one of the tables that you can access in that Castle manuscript shows the mobility values observed for the population of individuals with transfemoral amputation with and without microprocessor knees. Now we do it twice. We have a curve for those with a dysvascular etiology, and we have it for those with a traumatic etiology. And then we plot that curve for microprocessor users and non-microprocessor users, and you see very different curves. So for example, in the dysvascular community, you see this progressive decline in mobility that sort of starts at age 55 and continues to decline all the way into their mid-80s. When you look at the curve for microprocessor users, you see that mobility curve rise and hold at a much higher mobility level, to the point where when you look at an individual with a dysvascular amputation in their early 70s, there's a pretty striking contrast between their mobility if they get access to that microprocessor technology. So this kind of goes back to what I said at the very beginning, right? The goal of the Institute is to enhance patient access. So when we can produce studies like this that follow 30,000 amputees and demonstrate clearly and consistently that access to this technology increases their mobility level by 10 points, that's a win for the entire field. That's a win for an entire patient population, because we understand the impact of that technology on their overall health and well-being.
Yeah, it's awesome because it's something that we probably inherently know or would like to hope is the truth, but now we have the data behind it. And you said tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of data points. It's just an awesome way to verify and really confirm what we all want to know and hope is going on.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it.
With that being said, the SafeAMP studies were featured heavily throughout the report as well. What were a few highlights from this series?
So when we talk about SafeAMP 1 was in our last annual report, but SafeAMP 1 was probably one of our more striking manuscripts from the first report. That was the report that says individuals who are walking with a non-microprocessor knee are 2.5 times more likely to sustain an injurious fall. That was the big manuscript that tied microprocessor use with fall rate. And so if you pair that with what we just talked about in Castle, we have some powerful papers that talk about the impact of microprocessor knees, right? Not only do they increase mobility, but they decrease the risk of injurious falls. All important, or both very important talking points relative to that technology. SafeAMP 2 was the second publication in that series, and that looked at the relationship between mobility more generally and injurious fall rates. We categorized our patients as having low, mid, and high levels of mobility, and then we took a look at the injurious fall rates observed in those three populations. And what we found is that compared to those at higher mobility levels, those with low and mid-level mobility had 2 times the odds of an injurious fall. So it's really similar to what we said relative to MPKs, but now it's a little bit more generic. If you can enhance mobility, when folks have higher levels of mobility, not only are they more mobile, they're less likely to sustain injurious falls. That's probably an important distinction to make, guys. High-level amputees or high mobility amputees probably do fall. They just don't get hurt. They get up and keep going. The individuals who fall and get hurt, the individuals who fall and have to go to the hospital, fall and have to go to their doctor, our data would suggest that those individuals, for the most part, tend to be individuals walking at lower mobility levels. So if you want to protect an individual from those injurious falls, our data would suggest one of the best ways to do that is facilitate greater mobility. That might be with technology, that might be with a change in socket design, that might be physical therapy. But if you can enhance their mobility, that does appear to have a protective effect against injurious falls. I should add here, when you go to the write-up on this paper within the annual report, it's compelling to see that mobility matters relative to fall risk. Sex does not. Cause of amputation does not. Amputation level does not. So when we look at what really predicts that risk of injurious falls, mobility is pretty striking.
That's awesome. That coincides with some of the other podcasts we've done where, like Nicole Verkeilen and her group, one of their big sayings is movement therapy, and just even the mental impact that mobility and continuous movement have on people. And I would imagine that the confidence, when you're talking about falls and injurious falls, confidence is a big thing involved in that. And if you have greater mobility skills, your confidence is going to go up, and you're probably just a little bit more apt to even do the appropriate thing when you fall. Am I correct in thinking that? And that's probably not in your data. That's more of an opinion question, but
no, I mean, you could probably have a podcast on falls in amputees. It's sort of a really rich area of discovery. Yes, that's the biggest concern. I mean, do we see injury in falls? We do. And are those injuries expensive to the healthcare system and to the patient? They are. But even beyond those costs, there's sort of this hidden impact. Once you take that fall, you're less likely to get up and take that chance, right? And so our biggest concern is that these falls lead to inactivity, and then it's a cycle. Right, because as you're inactive, your endurance goes down, your strength goes down, and you're less you're going to be more inclined to be less active. So yeah, the movement is medicine, and sitting is the new smoking. That's one I heard.
That's right. I love it. Well, so okay, let's switch gears a little bit over to another facet of the report, and this is the O-Pro-M. Please tell us about the O-Pro-M, the motivation behind it, its development, and when it should be used.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. The O-Pro-M, this is the Orthotic Patient-Reported Outcomes for Mobility, O-Pro-M. This is an outcome measure that we developed in collaboration with the University of Washington. Many of your listeners are probably familiar with the PLUS-M, the Prosthetic Limb User Survey of Mobility. We've been using it routinely within our clinics, but I think a lot of clinicians are using it out in and outside of Hanger. We've seen that instrument used in a lot of the recent literature relative to lower limb amputees. In fact, all the conversations we've had so far today on mobility are based on outcomes that were collected using this PLUS-M outcome instrument. So the PLUS-M is an outcome instrument that surveys the relative difficulty that an amputee associates with a given physical task or walking environment. It was made with the amputee in mind. It was developed through amputee focus groups so that it was really asking questions that were relevant to that population. We recognize the value of having a similar tool for individuals that use lower limb orthoses. So we went through a very similar development process. We sat down and had focus groups with users of lower limb orthoses to understand which walking environments were most difficult for them, which walking environments represented a real challenge, which walking environments were most impacted by their orthosis when they used it or chose not to use it. So we went through a fairly extensive development process. I mean, we're talking several years and millions of dollars with our collaborators, again, at the University of Washington, to develop the O-Pro-M as a complement to the Plus-M. So the Plus-M is for your lower limb prosthesis users. The O-Pro-M is a very similar instrument that you can use for your lower limb orthosis users. So that's the population it's intended for. We're very excited to have the instrument in place. We've published a few manuscripts on it. We've presented several different papers on it, and we're starting to collect outcomes with this tool in that population. And what's in front of us is a lot of the things that we've talked about this morning, right? Once we can actually quantify orthotic mobility, we can start to answer some pretty important questions relative to fall risk, relative to quality of life, relative to satisfaction. So we're excited about the possibilities ahead. One of the challenges, I did a systematic review for the Academy, the American Academy, a couple years ago with a colleague from Sweden, Nerlin Ramstrand, where we were looking at the various outcome measures that have been used in the stroke population. And as we went through that exercise, we found that there were some outcome measures that were able to distinguish between an individual with no orthosis and an individual with an orthosis. Our measures were sensitive enough to discern the difference between those two conditions. But we really didn't find any measures that were sensitive enough to determine a difference between orthosis A and orthosis B. What we found with the O-Pro-M is that it does have that sensitivity. We're really excited because this measure is sensitive enough that if we move you from one design to another design and we see an improvement in your mobility, this instrument is sensitive enough that it captures that benefit. So we're actually in a position where we can quantify the benefits of these different designs. It couldn't come at a better time, right? This is an exciting time in orthotics when we start talking about triple action ankle joints. We start talking about microprocessor KAFOs. Right, we've got these exciting orthotic technologies that are really empowering patients to do some cool things. Well, we have to be able to measure that difference, right? We have to be able to go back to our pay sources, to our policymakers, and say, when you invest in this technology, we see this level of benefit. Here's the clear value proposition between this investment in technology and the subsequent patient performance and patient outcomes.
Am I correct in assuming that the patient population intended for this survey, the O-Pro-M, is much larger just because of, by definition, there's more people using orthosis than prosthetics? And do you think that you guys are going to have this explosion of findings just because the data is there? Like, are you excited about that?
I am. You're spot on. It is a much larger population. When we started collecting data, when we really made that commitment to outcomes, we had a prosthetic instrument in place, right? The Plus-M existed, it was validated, we could use it. It's taken us a few years to catch up in the orthotic space. It's taken us a few years to get this instrument developed. But Brendan, to your point, it's a big population. We see a lot of these folks, and we're going to catch up quickly. Once we get this instrument fully in place within our clinics, we anticipate collecting a lot of data fairly quickly so that we can catch up and start making similar observations to what we've done in the lower limb prosthetic space.
Yeah, that is super exciting. Well, good for you guys and great for the industry, really, that now we've got a whole new way to capture this data and form a baseline again. So a lot of props to you and your team, and thank you for what you're doing.
No, thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit.
Yeah.
Phil, this all translates so well. What other takeaways could clinicians pull from the report and adopt into their clinics?
Travis, that's a great question. Another section that I think your listeners might enjoy is the section that summarizes the activity relative to users of upper limb prostheses. In our last annual report, we shared some data from a collaboration with the University of Missouri where we looked at how transradial amputees use their device. And what we found, what we reported last year, or in that last annual report, is that when you actually put activity trackers, right, you put accelerometers on the end of their prostheses and have them live for a few days, what you find is that amputees very rarely engage in what we might describe as single-handed or unimanual activities with their prosthesis. I think our data found that only 20 minutes a day does the prosthesis act in isolation. By contrast, the average engagement of the prosthesis in bimanual activities and two-handed activities is 4 hours a day. So prostheses are worn, prostheses are used, they just tend to be used in bimanual activities. So as a follow-up to that observation from the last report, we've got some summaries in this year's annual report that look at the impact of the prosthesis on bimanual functionality. So we summarize a presentation that we gave earlier where we looked at bimanual function among a series of patients that were not currently using their prosthesis, and then we looked at that same group after they had received their prosthesis. And not surprisingly, kind of what you said earlier, Brendan, we're able to confirm what we all have hoped is the case. But when these patients are successfully fit with the prosthesis, their bimanual physical function scores go up. They're able to do more in this realm of bimanual function. So that's one important take home, recognizing that upper limb prostheses are used much more often in bimanual tasks, and our upper limb prosthesis users do experience a meaningful improvement in upper limb function once they receive their prosthesis. A second observation that I think your readers might enjoy if you flip the page over has to do with usage patterns. This was a paper that was written in collaboration with some partners at the VA and Northwestern University, where we surveyed a number of upper limb prosthesis users, and we asked them whether or not they used their prosthesis to perform a series of tasks. And some of those were one-handed tasks, and some of those were two-handed tasks. Well, when you look at individuals with unilateral amputation, you find what I just described. Individuals are much more likely to report using their prosthesis if it's a two-handed activity, and the engagement in one-handed activities was fairly low. An interesting observation is that when you ask the same questions of individuals with bilateral amputation, it flips. So individuals with bilateral amputations report greater engagement in one-handed tasks than they do in two-handed tasks. Isn't that interesting? But when you look at the list of tasks, our bilateral population is more likely to engage their prostheses if it's a one-handed task or in the one-handed tasks than they are in what we would characterize as two-handed tasks.
Wow, this is also interesting. I mean, you're kind of blowing my mind, and this is great because it is confirming my hopes. I do have a rogue question. Maybe for somebody that is just looking to dive into that upper limb analysis, can you tell us a differentiation between a one-handed task and a two-handed task? I know the usage, but just give us an example of what daily activity would be of each.
Yeah, I can give you some examples. So for example, some of the one-handed tasks we asked about was eating with a utensil, writing your name, opening a door with a knob, or using a key in a lock. Whereas some of the two-handed tasks are things like using a hammer and a nail, carrying a laundry basket, taking $1 from your wallet, cutting meat, tend to think of that as a two-handed activity, opening a water bottle, or tying your shoes, for example.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, this is awesome. Again, thank you so much. Is there anything else that we didn't hit on that you would like to add, or even just some thanks you want to give to some of your co-collaborators or people you work with?
Well, thank you for that opportunity. I should extend my appreciation to all the people at the end of the report, right? So if you dive into the report itself, it lists some of our academic partners. It lists some of our funding agencies. It lists some of our industry collaborators. It lists our external advisory board. And it also lists all of the leadership and associates of the Institute. And if you flip through that section, you realize that this is definitely a team project. It definitely takes a village. And there's a lot of talented individuals, along with a lot of committed organizations that have enabled us to tackle some of the research that we summarize in this report. So the last thing I would say is, man, come check it out. Right? It's not hard to find. I'm sure you can drop a link there in the podcast. But if you're just listening and on your drive, all you do is Google the Hanger Institute. The first response will take you to the Institute page. And once you get on the Institute page, there's a big banner that gives you access to the annual report. We have been very intentional. Everything we find, we try and share. We've really tried to make sure that any observation we have that advances the field, that advocates for patient access, we want to put that in the hands of the entire field. So it's an open invitation. Please come and check out the report and see what findings you can grab in there that might support, the next case that you're going to see in the days and weeks ahead. There's a lot in there that might help you make the case for access for a given technology, for example, for a target patient.
Yeah, I thank you so much. And this truly is a all boats rise with a high tide type of situation. And thank you for putting forth all this data and the outcomes and sharing it with us.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Travis. Always grateful for the opportunity to summarize some of the activity.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll see you again.
Anytime. Call me anytime.
To access the full report or connect with Phil on LinkedIn, follow the link in our show notes.
Thank you for listening to the O&P Check-in, an SPS podcast. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, be sure to leave a review and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Have a question or topic suggestion? Email us at spspodcast@spsco.com. See you next time.